My name is Nora Ashby. I'm 36, and I read structural drawings for a living, blueprints, load specs, soil reports. If something's designed to hold weight, I find out whether it actually can. I've been doing this long enough to know that the things most likely to collapse are the ones that look the most solid from the outside. At my younger sister's wedding, the groom's mother stood up during the ceremony, called my sister worthless in front of 140 guests, and threw a legal document at her like it was garbage. My parents sat perfectly still and said nothing. I didn't. I walked up that aisle, picked up every scattered page, and tore them straight down the center. The sound it made was final. Clean. Then I took my sister's hand and walked her out into the afternoon light. That felt like an ending. It wasn't. 3 weeks later, I placed a single manila folder on a table made of expensive stone and watched two very powerful people realize the ground had been collapsing underneath them for months. This is how a woman who carries a red pen and reads every word of everything dismantled a family that had never once been held accountable for anything. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quietest women in the room are usually the ones you should be watching most carefully. If you've ever had to stay level while someone louder tried to flatten you, you already know exactly what this story is about. Stay with me to the very end. First, you need to understand who I am, because it matters for every single thing that happens next. I read the whole document. Every time. Before anyone signs anything. Before I initial a single line. It's a professional habit. A missed specification in a structural drawing can bring a stairwell down, but the truth is I've been like this since childhood. Our mother died when I was 22 and my sister Violet was 14. Our father folded inward in a way that never fully opened back up. So I kept things running. I worked late shifts. I finished my engineering degree. I took the job and came home and sat at the kitchen table and checked Violet's math homework and helped her fill out her FAFSA and told her which subscription to cancel when the money got thin. People think that kind of relentless responsibility is endearing. It isn't. It makes you someone others lean on at funerals and avoid at dinner parties. I knew this about myself. What I was still learning at 36 was that you can love a person so completely that you never let them develop the muscles they need, and that when real difficulty finally arrives, they're not prepared to carry it. Violet made jewelry. She took long walks with no destination. She remembered everyone's birthday and made people feel genuinely seen without trying. I envied that. I also worried about it, because the people who make strangers feel chosen can attract the kind of person who wants to do the choosing for them. I told myself I was projecting. I'm almost never projecting. The night Violet called to tell me she'd met someone named Elliot Hartwell, I heard something new in her voice, a brightness with something careful beneath it, like a door that had been newly painted to hide what was wrong with it underneath. The Hartwells were precisely the kind of family that expects you to know who they are before they've told you. 4 generations of wealth, a charitable foundation with their name on it, a lake house, a Christmas card mailing list that functioned as a social credential. The first time I visited their primary residence, I pressed my fingertips against the foyer wall and felt cold imported stone that didn't hold warmth at all. I remember thinking, a home shouldn't feel like a mausoleum. Violet seemed luminous in that house, at first. New earrings. A posture she'd borrowed from somewhere. A laugh that arrived half a beat late, like she was checking it against an internal standard before releasing it. Elliot was attractive the way catalog models are attractive, in a way that doesn't quite survive closer scrutiny. He remembered the name of my firm. He refilled your water glass before you asked. By every visible measure, he was perfect. And perfect things are exactly what I reach for my pen for. I started watching my sister the way I watch a foundation survey, looking for deviation, for anything that didn't read level. Her phone was always face down now. When it buzzed, she'd check the screen and then set it back down without responding, and a small tension would pass through her jaw. Once, mid-story, she glanced at Elliot to gauge whether the sentence was going to be allowed. I had never in my life seen Violet self-censor. On the drive home, I asked gently whether everything was going well. She said she'd never been happier. She said it completely sincerely. And that was the thing that worried me most, because genuinely happy people don't flinch at a text message. I didn't have a name for what I was reading. I only knew that when the numbers don't add up, you don't sign anything. You go back and find the clause you missed. Constance Hartwell ran her family like an operation. She was 62, precisely dressed, and spoke in the particular register of a woman who has spent decades making cruelty sound like generosity. At the engagement dinner, she seated me next to her, which I understood immediately as an assessment, not a courtesy. She asked what I did for work. I told her. She smiled in the way that people smile when they're tolerating something they find unfortunate, and said it must be wonderful to work so practically with my hands. Then she turned to Violet. "And you make jewelry," she said. "How sweet. People really do need their little hobbies." She let the words sit there until it soured. I watched my sister try not to disappear into her chair. I watched my parents laugh along with everything Constance said, eager and uneasy. Constance talked about the family all evening. The foundation, the legacy, the name. She looked at Violet across the candle flames, and I caught a single unguarded moment in her expression. She wasn't looking at a future daughter-in-law. She was looking at a liability she hadn't yet decided how to manage. I kept my voice even and asked one question: how had Elliot and Violet met? Something shifted behind Constance's eyes. A small recalibration. The expression of someone remembering there are topics they'd prefer not to have surfaced in public. "At a charity auction," she said. "He's always been so generous with his time." I made a note. Not on paper, in the back of my mind, where I keep the readings that don't resolve yet. Generous with his time. I'd come back to that. It would come back to me, too. The red flags didn't announce themselves. They whispered from corners. A woman named Sophie Reyes, Violet's closest friend from university, called me one evening and started a sentence 4 times before she completed it. "I just want her to be careful," Sophie finally said. "There were things about Elliot before." I asked what kinds of things. She went quiet. She said maybe she shouldn't have called. And then she didn't call again, and when I tried her number it had been disconnected. People don't go silent over gossip. They go silent when silence has a cost. So I did what I always do. I started reading. I searched Elliot Hartwell through every public channel available to me. And the strange thing wasn't that I found problems. It was that I found nothing at all. No rough edges. No messy history. No old photos. No court records under his name. No minor controversies. A man that's smoothly presented isn't lucky. He's curated. Somebody had spent money on his absence from the record. You don't pay to hide a clean history. When I mentioned Sophie's call to Violet, she defended him so fast the words tripped over each other. Sophie was jealous, Violet said. Sophie didn't understand him. And then, in one unguarded moment, she said a name, just a first and last name, and dismissed it immediately. An old situation, she said. A woman who'd caused trouble. And then she changed the subject so completely the conversation just ended. I wrote the name down in the inside cover of my field notebook, next to the load calculations. I didn't know yet that I'd need it. Here's the thing about my parents' silence that I didn't understand for months. It wasn't simply weakness. It had a structure. I found out by accident, the way you find most structural failures, by reaching for something else and finding the rot underneath. My father's hardware business had been struggling for 2 years. I knew this, the way you know things about people you love but choose not to examine too closely. What I hadn't known was who had been keeping it afloat. My mother mentioned it over coffee, a bridge loan, she said, from a family friend. When I pressed for the name, she poured coffee into an already full mug and said it quietly, like a confession. The Hartwells. Specifically, Constance. $45,000. framed as a kindness between soon-to-be family. Terms that had been explained verbally but never properly reviewed. My father, who taught me to read every word before you sign anything, had signed something he'd never actually read, because he was frightened and someone had handed him a lifeline with a hook in the end of it. That was when my parents' careful, consistent silence finally made complete sense. When someone controls your survival, they don't need to threaten you out loud. The debt does it for them. "Mom, please," my mother said when I sat across from her. She could read my face the way only a parent can. "Don't start a war. It's almost done. They'll be family." I looked at her and felt something settle in my chest, cold and certain, like a calculation that finally resolves. My parents weren't complicit out of cruelty. They were complicit because they were bought. And you can't be angry at a drowning person for grabbing whatever's in reach, but you can remove what they're drowning in. I just didn't know the full cost of that yet. The prenuptial agreement arrived by courier 11 days before the wedding. It came from a law firm whose name I recognized, the kind of firm that handles things for families who want things handled quietly. The attorney who delivered it used the word formality 6 times in a single phone call. That word, used that many times, means the opposite of what it says. Violet was told to sign it. No independent attorney. No itemized disclosure of Elliot's assets. No time to review. Just a deadline shaped like a wedding day. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the document and my red pen, and I felt my entire posture change. Because this I knew how to read. A contract is architecture made of language. You can see where it's designed to hold and where it's designed to fail, and who it's designed to fail on. The terms were punishing. In a divorce, Violet would receive nothing. She waived all future support. She signed a confidentiality clause so broad it could have covered her private thoughts. But it was the timing that told the real story. You don't hand someone a life-altering agreement at the wedding door unless the wedding itself is the coercion. The rush was the weapon. The altar was the clock. I read the whole thing. Then I read it again. Then I got to the recitals, that gray, technical block at the front of the document that most people skip completely. And one line stopped my pen cold. It referenced, by name and case number, a prior confidential settlement. A settlement reference buried in a prenuptial agreement is exactly like a patch on a wall. It tells you precisely where the damage was. I uncapped my pen and circled it. Then I went back through the entire document and marked the margins until they bled red. The confidentiality language wasn't standard boilerplate. It was custom-fitted. It reached backward and forward simultaneously, binding Violet to silence about matters previously resolved by the Hartwell family, which is a profoundly strange thing to demand of a woman before she's even married into the name. You don't write a clause like that for a marriage. You write it to give a cover-up a new place to hide. The reference named a settlement number that meant nothing to me yet. But it existed. And existence, in the public record, is everything. I drove to Violet's the next morning, the house she'd moved into with Elliot 4 months earlier, all that cold stone and tall silence, and I tried to bring this up without sounding like an emergency. I asked if she knew what the settlement clause referred to. She went very still. She said it was old. She said Elliot had explained it. Some woman from years ago who'd fabricated a story against him, and the family had made it go away. She used the phrase, made it go away, the way people use phrases they've borrowed from someone else. I asked who the woman was. Violet's eyes moved toward the hallway, toward wherever Elliot might be. She said she didn't want to talk about it in the house. I didn't push. I drove back to my apartment with a case number in my notebook next to a woman's name I'd written months before. And that night I did what I do. Here is something most people don't realize about the court system. The contents of a sealed case are locked. The fact of it is not. Civil dockets are public record. The existence of a lawsuit, the names of the parties, the dates of filing, the motions entered, All of it lives in a public index accessible to anyone with patience and a computer terminal. I pull permits and easements and legal descriptions for work. The courthouse stopped being a foreign country to me years ago. I went to the civil index and searched the Hartwell name. The problem wasn't a shortage of results. Old money generates litigation the way old houses generate dust. I needed a narrowing point, a date, to cut through the noise. The settlement reference gave me a number, but not a year I could confirm. The name in my notebook gave me a person, but no proof she'd ever filed anything publicly at all. I sat in the courthouse annex with a cooling cup of coffee and felt the obstruction of it. This is the part no one ever tells you about doing the right thing. It isn't dramatic. It's a search terminal and 100 wrong results and the steady patience of someone who refuses to leave until she finds the line she missed. I needed one fixed point. A date that could anchor the search. My sister's wedding provided it. In the worst way a piece of information can be provided. The ceremony was held on the Hartwell estate. White tent, manicured lawn, the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than my monthly insurance. Violet was beautiful in a way that made me want to cry, not from joy, but from recognition. She looked like someone who had been holding themselves very carefully for a very long time. I sat in the second row beside my parents, who wore their good clothes and their carefully blank faces. The officiant began. Then, before the vows could be spoken, Constance Hartwell rose from her seat in the front row. She stood slowly, deliberately, the way someone stands when they've rehearsed the moment. She had papers in her hand, the unsigned prenuptial agreement, and she walked into the center aisle and turned to face the assembled guests with the bearing of someone about to make an announcement at a board meeting. She would not, she said in a voice designed to carry, watch her son marry into a situation that endangered what 4 generations had built. Then she looked directly at my sister. And she said it. She said the word that doesn't belong in any sentence that ends with someone's name. She threw the papers. They hit Violet's chest and scattered across the grass at her feet. The tent went completely silent. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. They stared at their laps. My mother whispered, not to me, not to Violet, but to the air, that she just didn't want a scene. Something inside me became very quiet and very clear. I stood up. I walked up the aisle in flat shoes through the flowers and the held breath. I crouched and gathered every page from the grass and straightened them the way you straighten papers you're about to file. Then I tore them directly in half. The sound was clean and absolute. It cut through the silence like something being decided. I held out my hand to my sister. "We're leaving," I said. We walked out together across the stone entryway and into the afternoon sunlight, and behind us, 140 people sat frozen in white chairs while Constance Hartwell stood alone at the front of her own ceremony. People thought that was the ending. It wasn't even the beginning. Here is what Constance gave me, standing in that tent in front of witnesses. She had just announced, publicly and on a documented date, exactly when she had tried to force my sister to sign that agreement. That date was now a fixed point I could anchor a courthouse search to. She'd handed me what I'd been unable to find on my own. She thought she was ending something. She'd just started it. That night, Violet came apart in my apartment. Small, warm, smelling like the dried lavender I keep near the radiator. Everything marble is not. She cried with the particular intensity of someone who has been holding it back for months. And then, finally outside that house and away from him, she told me the truth she'd been carrying alone. It wasn't one incident. It was hundreds of small ones. He selected what she wore and called it taste. He tracked her social calendar and called it care. He monitored her phone and called it honesty. He managed her friendships until the closest ones had quietly disappeared. There was one night early in the relationship that she wouldn't describe in full, a night she kept circling back to without landing on, where she had understood for the first time that the locks in that house operated from the outside in. And then she said the name. The name I'd written in my notebook months ago. She told me what Elliot had let slip in an unguarded moment. Proud of it, she said, and slightly drunk. A woman who'd made accusations. A family who'd made her go away. I held my sister and kept my voice even, because she didn't need my anger. She had plenty of her own. "I believe you," I said. "I believe all of it." Then I asked her one question, the only one that mattered for what I was about to do. When had the woman's accusations been made? What year? Violet thought. She gave me a season and a year, a window narrow enough to mean something. I wrote it beneath the case number and the name in my notebook. 3 entries now, pointing in the same direction. My sister fell asleep on the sofa around 2 in the morning. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn with cold coffee and my notebook and felt, for the first time in weeks, like the wall had a door. Monday morning I went back to the courthouse terminal with a specific window to search. The Hartwell returns dropped from years to months, then to a handful of cases, then to one that made my stomach turn over quietly. A civil action. Plaintiff listed as Jane Doe. Courts allow this when someone is protecting their physical safety. Defendant. Elliot Hartwell. Filed, resolved within the calendar year, marked settled, file sealed by joint stipulation. Sealed. That word is supposed to feel permanent. But here's what the Hartwells either never knew or assumed I wouldn't understand. Sealing a file hides its contents. It does not erase the filing's existence. The docket entry remains. The caption remains. The motion for a protective order, and the fact that a judge signed it, remains in the public index where I was sitting. A protective order is not granted for nothing. A judge reviews the request and determines that there is cause sufficient to act. That act is on the record. It cannot be settled away. The settlement case number on the docket matched the reference number in Violet's prenuptial agreement. The same matter. The same silence, being extended to cover one more woman. I fed paper into the annex printer and watched the docket sheet emerge line by line. I took it to my car and sat with it in the parking lot while the engine cooled around me. Then I uncapped my red pen and drew a single circle around the case number. One clean, closed loop around a string of digits on a public court record. I want you to hold that image, because I held it for everything that came next. People expect justice to arrive like a thunderclap, dramatic, immediate, unmistakable. Mostly it arrives as a circled number on a printout in a parking lot, and a woman who decides not to look away from it. I understood, sitting there, exactly what money can and cannot do. It can seal a file. It cannot unfile a complaint. It can buy silence. It cannot buy the record of a judge who took a sworn allegation seriously enough to sign an order. The Hartwell method came into focus like a developing photograph. They didn't make problems untrue. They made them quiet. And they had designed my sister's prenuptial agreement to be the next purchase in a long history of bought silence. But somewhere out there, a woman had walked into a courthouse and filed a complaint under oath. And the fact of that walk, and the fact of that oath, was sitting in my car in daylight. Finding a woman who has spent years deliberately disappearing takes time. And it requires a specific kind of honesty, because the difference between finding someone to help and finding someone to use is everything. I didn't track anyone. I didn't bluff my way into sealed records. I worked the public index and one legitimate contact, a paralegal named Rosa, who had moved into family law after years of property litigation and who could look at a complex legal situation without flinching. Through careful, lawful steps, Rosa helped me learn the woman's name. Clara Webb. She had moved across the country and built a new life under her married name. A job she liked. A community that didn't know the story. I understood the instant I found her that I was holding something fragile. Her settlement bound her to silence. An unexpected contact from a stranger could feel like the past returning to threaten everything she'd rebuilt. So I didn't call. I wrote a short letter. I told her who I was. I told her what had happened at a wedding. I told her I had found nothing private, only the public docket anyone could access, and that I was asking her for nothing. I left my number. And then I wrote one sentence at the bottom. You don't owe us anything. But if it ever helps to know you weren't alone, I'm here. I mailed it. And then I did the hardest thing in this entire story. I waited. I didn't follow up. I didn't look for her again. Pushing is what they had done to her, and I was not going to borrow the enemy's methods in the name of defeating them. Somewhere across the country, a woman read a letter, thought about it for 2 days, and made a decision. Constance didn't wait. Patience was never her instrument. While I was sitting still, she went to work, because the only strategy she had ever known was pressure and shame. Within days, a version of events began circulating through every community our family touched. Violet was an opportunist who had chased the Hartwell name and been appropriately removed. Violet was unstable. Violet had humiliated a decent family at their own son's celebration. Constance had 40 years of favors and a foundation gala guest list, and she spent them like someone who had been saving them for exactly this moment. Then she reached for the lever she was most confident about. She called my parents. She reminded them, with great sweetness, about the loan. About how terms could be revisited. About how loyalty was the only real currency that mattered between families. My mother called me that night, frightened. If Violet doesn't apologize and smooth things over, Constance is going to call in the note, she said. All of it, immediately. I listened to my mother's voice and recognized the strategy in one move. Constance had built her entire system on the certainty that the people she hurt would always have a reason to stay quiet. A debt. A reputation. A child to protect. Mom, I said. Don't promise her anything. Don't apologize. Give me 2 weeks. I heard her hold her breath on the other end of the line, the sound of someone trying to decide whether they can afford to be brave. I wasn't going to ask her to be. I was going to make it so she didn't need to be. I needed 2 things. I needed the legal weight of what I'd found assessed by someone qualified to assess it. And I needed the debt gone. Rosa connected me with a family law attorney named Patricia Kwan, who had a small office with 2 good windows and chairs that had seen better decades. I sat across from her and slid the prenuptial agreement across the desk. She read it the way I read it, slowly, with a pen, frowning at the recitals. When she finished, she set it down and said something I will keep for the rest of my life. This isn't a strong agreement. It's a demand dressed up as a document. Then she walked me through the specifics, carefully, the way honest professionals do when they want you to understand the limits of what they're telling you. In most states, including ours, a prenuptial agreement faces serious enforceability challenges when it looks like these facts. Signed under time pressure with the wedding itself functioning as the coercion, no independent legal counsel for the party waiving everything, no financial disclosure, no accounting at all of what the wealthier party actually owns. A full waiver of support signed hours before a ceremony with no attorney present. Courts look at the totality of those circumstances and ask whether there was genuine informed consent. The answer here, she said, was unlikely to satisfy a judge. I asked why a family with this much money would draft such a weak document. She looked at me for a moment. Because they've never had to enforce one, she said. The threat was always sufficient. Nobody ever read it all the way through and said no. I almost laughed. The weapon they'd used to terrify my sister was the weakest thing in the room. The loan was next. I had 12 years of savings, a stable income, and a credit union that liked engineers who showed up on time and paid their debts. I sat my parents down at their own kitchen table, the one I had grown up doing homework at, and I told them I was paying off the Hartwell note in full, immediately, and carrying the balance myself at terms we would write down and both read aloud before anyone signed anything. My mother started crying. My father held the pen for a long time without writing. I should have read it, he said. The first one. I should have read every word. I told him it was done. The only thing that mattered now was that no one had a rope around us anymore. By the end of the week, the money was gone from our family, transferred in full back to the Hartwells, the leverage severed clean. I didn't ask my parents to be brave. I just removed the thing that had been making courage impossible. Whatever they chose to do after that would be genuinely theirs. 2 days later, a letter arrived in a heavy envelope from Whitlock and Associates, the Hartwell family firm. Cease and desist. Harassment. Interference with a confidential matter. A great deal of Latin, deployed like artillery. I sent it directly to Patricia Kwan. Her reply was brief and almost serene. The confidentiality agreement they were citing belonged either to a woman named Clara Webb or to a prenuptial document that had never been signed. Neither one bound me. You cannot enforce a stranger's gag order against a different person. I had accessed only public records, records that were public specifically because the law requires them to be. The protective order they were so desperate to contain had been granted by a judge and could not be retroactively ungranted by any amount of settlement money. The threats stopped. Here is what an aggressive cease and desist letter tells you when it's written about public information. It tells you exactly where the damage is. You don't write a letter that frightened over nothing. You write it when you're trying to shut down something that's already started opening. Whitlock had sent a roadmap to the thing the Hartwells most needed to contain. I filed his letter behind the docket sheet in my folder. The decision that followed was not mine to make. That was the hardest and the most important thing I had learned through all of it. One evening I sat across from my sister in my apartment and laid everything out. The docket. The circled case number. Patricia's assessment of the prenup. And an offer I had received by phone 3 days earlier, from a woman who had decided, after 2 days with a letter in her hands, to make one specific, carefully lawyered choice. I told Violet the facts. Then I stopped talking, which is not my natural state. I told her she could do nothing. She could take her piece, relocate, build something new with no one watching. I would back that completely. Whatever she chose, including nothing. She sat with it for a long time, turning my red pen over in her hands. He told me no one would ever believe me, she said finally. He believed that. He'd practiced believing it. She set the pen down. I want to stop being quiet about it. I'm not apologizing for being humiliated at my own wedding. And if Clara is willing to stand next to me, I want the truth said out loud where people have to hear it. I asked if she understood what that meant. That it would be public, documented, witnessed. No manipulation, no secrets. Just 2 women telling the truth in daylight in front of people who had been carefully kept from hearing it. She said yes. For the first time in over a year, I wasn't carrying her. I was standing beside her. The way someone should have stood beside a young woman called a liability 40 years ago before she learned that cruelty was the only language that felt like safety. We had 3 days until the Hartwell Foundation Gala. Constance had built us a stage without knowing it. The gala was the family's annual signature event. Black tie, donor tables, local press, a year's worth of philanthropic reputation concentrated into one evening. This year, word had quietly circulated that there would be remarks about family, loyalty, and the importance of not being misled by people with ulterior motives. A carefully managed rehabilitation of the Hartwell name. Constance had even extended an invitation to Violet. She was welcome to attend and offer her apologies. The family, it was implied, was prepared to be gracious. She wanted the public's surrender. She had designed the entire evening around the certainty that a shamed woman would either stay home or show up desperate. So we accepted the invitation. Violet and I arrived together on time, in clean and simple clothes that made no attempt to compete with the room. Clara had flown in that afternoon and met us in the parking lot. The 3 of us stood for a moment beneath the entrance portico, that same pale stone, that same held in cold, and Clara looked up at the building and exhaled slowly. I never imagined coming back to a place like this voluntarily, she said. I had Patricia on call. I had the docket, the prenup, and my red pen clipped inside the folder the way it always is. I wasn't nervous. I recognized the feeling from job sites, The stillness that arrives after the math is finished and verified and you're waiting for the pour to begin. Constance had assembled the stage, the lighting, and the audience. She had done all the work. We only brought the file. The ballroom was exactly what you'd expect. 200 people, candlelight off stone, a string quartet, a society columnist near the front with an open notebook. Constance worked the room like someone who owned it, because she largely believed she did. When she saw the three of us walk in, she made a small mistake. She smiled. She thought we'd come to fold. Midway through the evening, she took a microphone near the head table. The velvet voice. The talk of legacy and loyalty and the ease with which good faith people can be deceived. She looked directly at my sister when she said the last part. Then she invited Violet to come up and say a few words, certain that the words would be an apology. Violet's hand tightened on mine, and then she let it go, which was the most courageous thing I have ever watched another person do. She walked to the front of the room alone. She took the microphone that Constance held out. Constance's smile stayed in place, because she was still sure. Violet's voice shook on the first word. Then it steadied. "You stood up at my wedding," she said, "in front of all of you, and you called me worthless." The room went the particular quiet that happens when a script goes wrong in public. Constance reached for the microphone. Violet didn't surrender it. "I'm not here to apologize," she said. "I'm here because I am no longer afraid of your son." I stepped forward. I kept my voice at the level I use on job sites, carrying but not raised. "Before anyone forms an opinion about who to believe tonight," I said, "I want to make sure everyone here has access to what is already a matter of public record." I opened the folder on the head table. Marble again. I noticed the Hartwells had an enduring commitment to cold surfaces. I want to be precise about what I did and did not do, because precision is the entire point. No recordings. No private information. No sealed contents. Only public documents said out loud in public, which is all truth ever actually requires. First, the prenuptial agreement. I held it up. This document was placed in my sister's hands hours before the ceremony, with no independent counsel, no financial disclosure, and no time for review. Our family attorney has reviewed it and found it to present significant enforceability problems under applicable state law. A waiver signed under duress without counsel behind it is not a contract. It is a pressure tactic. They counted on no one reading it all the way through. A murmur moved through the room. Then I set down the second document. "This is a civil court docket," I said. "Anyone who wants to can access it tomorrow at the county courthouse. It is public record." It documents a lawsuit in which a woman filed a sworn complaint against Elliot Hartwell. A judge reviewed the filing and granted a protective order. I'm not going to stand here and call that a verdict, because it is not a verdict. But it is a documented public fact that a judge found sufficient cause to act. The Hartwell family settled the matter and sealed the file. They could seal the contents. They could not erase that the docket existed. And the confidentiality clause in my sister's prenuptial agreement, the one they were so eager for her to sign, references that exact settlement by its case number. They weren't protecting a marriage. They were extending an arrangement that had been running for years. I let that settle. Then I said the last thing quietly, because quiet was more powerful than anything else available to me. "I can't tell you what's inside the sealed file. But I'm not the only person in this room who knows what a protective order against Elliot Hartwell represents." And Clara Webb stepped out of the shadows beside my sister and into the candlelight. She faced a room full of people who had once been part of the machinery that paid for her silence. "My name is Clara Webb," she said, and her voice was steady and clear as a measured line. "I am the plaintiff in that case. My settlement prevents me from telling you what he did to me. It does not prevent me from standing here and telling you that it happened. I have watched structures fail before. There is a moment, right before the collapse, when the surface still looks intact and the failure is already total underneath. That is what happened to the Hartwell family in that ballroom. Elliot went pale. The color left his face all at once. He said Clara's name, first like a question, then like something desperate. The room turned toward him. He understood, in that moment, that the warmth and the charm and the practiced confidence were not going to work on an audience that had just heard the words protective order from a woman who had walked into a courthouse and filed them. He moved toward the exit. People made room for him without quite knowing why. That involuntary parting is its own kind of judgment. Constance broke. The composure came off her completely, and what was underneath it was not what she had spent 40 years curating. She screamed that we were fabricating everything. She screamed that Clara was a criminal who had extorted her family. She screamed that I was a nobody who worked with my hands and had no business being in a room like this. The room did not turn against her all at once. Rooms like that don't. Some faces went carefully expressionless, the practiced neutrality of people who have learned to wait until they know which way the money moves. A few couples quietly gathered their coats. Others went still with the uneasy silence of people who have heard something they cannot unhear and haven't decided yet what to do with it. Nobody applauded. Nobody had to. The reporter near the front kept writing. And that was the thing that mattered most. My parents were there. I hadn't been certain they would be. I had told them only that they were welcome, and that I wasn't asking anything of them. They sat near the back. I'd been braced for the old stillness, the studied blankness they'd worn for months. But the loan was gone now. The rope was cut. And in the quiet that opened up after Constance's screaming wound down, my father stood up. He was in a borrowed suit, and he was not the kind of man who makes speeches. He said it simply, in a voice that carried further than I think he intended. "Those are my daughters," he said. "Both of them are mine. And I am done sitting quiet while someone says otherwise." It wasn't long. It was more than enough. My mother took his hand. And the silence they had worn like armor for 12 months just lifted. Right there, in front of 200 people and a journalist's open notebook, a man who had been bought into silence decided he was done with the purchase. The real consequences arrived the way real consequences always do, slowly and on paper. The reporter's story ran that week. Carefully sourced. Public records only. Once it existed in print, inquiries followed in places money couldn't easily reach. The Foundation's board, corporate donors who quietly asked for more time to review their commitments, a venue that discovered a scheduling conflict. None of it was dramatic. All of it was real. Donors do not enjoy being associated with protective orders. Boards have fiduciary obligations. No one throws a contract at a bride twice when the first time has already been documented by a working journalist. Elliot was asked to step back from his foundation role within the month. The prenuptial agreement went precisely nowhere, because there was nothing to enforce and no one left with any interest in trying. I collected the folder from the marble tabletop, capped my pen, and found my sister in the thinning crowd. She wasn't crying. She was standing very straight, the posture of someone who has finally set down a weight they've been carrying alone for too long. "Are you okay?" I asked. "No," she said, almost smiling. "But I will be." The three of us walked out together, Violet, Clara, and me, across the cold stone portico for the second time. The fountain was still running in the dark the way it always ran, because the Hartwells paid for the appearance of permanence regardless of whether anyone was there to see it. Clara hugged my sister in the parking lot. Two women told the same lie by the same person, in different years, who had arrived at the same decision from different directions. "Thank you for standing beside me," Violet said. "You stood beside me first," Clara said. "I just heard about it from 2 states away." I drove my sister home to my small, warm apartment. For the first time in over a year, when her phone lit up on the seat between us, she didn't reach to flip it. She just let it glow. Violet rebuilt a small studio in the city first, with a kiln she'd bought used and teaching herself to fire things the way she wanted them. Then her own space, a little shop with her name above the door. She sells the kind of jewelry that makes strangers stop and ask where she got it. She sends me a piece every year on my birthday. I keep them on my windowsill in the good light. I still read everything. Every word, every clause, every margin note. I still carry a red pen. A family name is just sounds. It doesn't make you clean, and it doesn't make you what someone else calls you in front of witnesses. What you do in the daylight, that's the only thing that builds anything worth standing in. So when the truth is yours to tell, tell it plainly. Say it out loud in the light, where the people who tried to bury it have to stand there and hear it. You don't need to be loud. You don't need to be dramatic. You only need to be steady, and to have done the reading. That's the whole story. One torn document. One public docket. One sister who decided to stop hiding. One father who finally stood up. If it reminded you that silence is a choice and so is speaking, make the braver one. Before someone hands you a deadline shaped like a ceremony. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, send it to her.